Hey there, philosophical friend. So I was listening to a recent Senate hearing. I know, super boring, right? But it was actually interesting because it was on police reform. And at that Senate hearing, there were several comments made that I just sort of my philosophical senses went up and I thought something's not quite right about that. So I took a little time to kind of break it down. We're going to look at that today, and that'll shed light on some of the ways that we make fallacious reasoning regarding racism, and specifically as it relates to police reform. Then we're going to look at research by a social psychologist on the nature of implicit biases and how those can impact whether or not people act in a discriminatory fashion toward African Americans, specifically with regard to policing. And then last but not least, we're going to relate this to systemic racism and see how it all fits together. Welcome to the Philosophical Life. Now, let's jump into the slides. As you can see here, what we're going to do today is we're going to identify fallacies made by Senator John Cornyn and Vanita Gupta at that Senate Judiciary Hearing on policing reform that I mentioned at the start of the video. We're going to get on the table Dr. Jennifer Everharts Research on bias, race, and crime. And then we're going to explore the nature of implicit biases as they relate to racism and specifically systemic racism. So here's a little bit of the transcript of what went on at the Senate hearing. I was watching this in real time as it was playing out, and I thought something wasn't quite right. So I went back, did a little research, and found the transcript of what was talked about. And then I'm going to actually break down, do a little critical thinking on those comments. So let's actually get the comments on the table. So Senator John Cornyn is a Republican senator, and he was questioning this expert, Vanita Gupta, and he started off by saying the following: "You changed the phrase from systemic to structural racism. What does that mean? That means everything, every institution, every person in America is racist?" Gupta replied, "It means that there is bias built into existing institutions. There have been any number of courageous police who have spoken about systemic racism in history as well." Cornyn replied, "You think systemic or structural racism can exist in a system that requires individual responsibility? Or do you think it is one or the other?" Gupta said, "I think every American institution has been shaped by these forces, and our goal is to do what we can as policymakers, as advocates, to take that out and try to fight it in the modern day iterations that it appears." And they continued. Cornyn responded, "Do you agree basically that all Americans are racist?" Gupta replied, "I think that we have implicit bias and racial biases. Yes, I do." Then Cornyn responded, "Wow." Gupta said, "I think we are an amazing country that strives to be better every day. That's why I went into government, to make a more perfect union." And Cornyn responds, "You lost me when you want to take the acts of a few misguided, perhaps malicious individuals and subscribe to that all Americans, not just our 800,000 police officers, our 18,000 police departments. Thank you for your answer." Now let's break down those comments. So as you can see here, Cornyn's questions and comments sort of illicitly slid from systemic racism to individual racism. And you'll remember within the scope of just one comment, he went from systemic racism to Americans to all Americans. So that assumes that holding a system, that a system is racist, means that you assume that every individual making up the system is racist. And what I think Senator Cornyn did there is committed the fallacy of division, which resulted in basically him dismissing Gupta's important point about systemic racism in policing. And this is as Cornyn ended. You lost me when you want to take the acts of a few misguided, perhaps malicious individuals and subscribe that to all Americans, not just the police and the police departments. So because of where Cornyn led Gupta and the fallacy that he committed in his inquiry, he actually, in the end, was able to say, well, that's crazy. And so he just sort of dismissed her point. So let's take a closer look at this fallacy. As you can see in the diagram there is a breakdown, and you'll see that there is a whole, and we're imagining something is true of the whole. Let's say that the whole is racist, that the whole system, for instance, is systemically racist. Now, you improperly attribute what's true of the whole to parts of the whole. So if you imagine that the whole is either the whole policing system or the whole American system, which is where they end up, all of America basically is racist. It's systemically racist. Then what Senator Cornyn did is he pushed for or gave leading questions that suggested, led Gupta down the road of attributing that systemic racism, being racist as a system, to the individuals that comprise the system, such that each individual is racist. So here's an example of the fallacy of division in play. Salt is a non-poisonous compound, so that's true of salt. It's non-poisonous. Therefore, its component elements, sodium and chlorine, are non-poisonous. So you have non-poisonous being attributed to the whole, salt, and then you illicitly transfer that what's true of the whole to the parts. Obviously, sodium and chlorine can be toxic, and as you know, chlorine is highly poisonous. So it's false that what's true of the whole regarding salt is true of its components. Another example here, this airplane was made in Seattle. Great coffee in Seattle as well. Not just coffee, but airplanes. I think there's a great Boeing facility there as well. Don't quote me on that. Therefore, every component part of this airplane was made in Seattle. Obviously, that's false, commits the fallacy, because the component parts are probably sourced from all over the world. So here's the fallacy more explicitly laid out. America is comprised of systems that are racist. Therefore, every American, as part of that system, is racist. So that's the fallacy that Senator Cornyn committed, the fallacy of division. Now, Vanita Gupta is not off the hook either, I thought. So Gupta's reply implied an illicit slide from individual racism and every individual in America to systemic racism. Remember some of her last comments. And that assumes that every individual in the system being racist is what makes the whole system racist. And that committed the informal fallacy of composition, which is actually sort of the reverse of the fallacy of division. And that resulted, because she committed that fallacy, it resulted in her important points about systemic racism and policing being cast aside as false, because it's false that all Americans are racists. So we can look a little more closely at the fallacy of composition. And as you'll see on the diagram, there are parts, and something's true of the parts, and then the attribute that's true of the parts is improperly transferred to the whole. So here's one example. Less fuel is consumed by a car than a fire truck. Therefore, less fuel is consumed in the United States by cars than fire trucks. That's false, because there are more cars on the road than fire trucks, even though it's true of the parts that less fuel is consumed by a car than a fire truck. It doesn't hold that in the whole United States that less fuel is consumed by cars than fire trucks. Now, here's a little bit more careful breakdown of Gupta's argument, or where she was led if you recast it in the form of an argument. Number one, all police in America are American citizens. Number 2, all American citizens are racist. Remember, she bid on that and said yes. 3, thus, all police in America are racist. 4, police systems are comprised of police. 5, therefore, all police systems in America are racist. Now let's go ahead and look at a quote by another person that was at the hearing. And this is from Philip Atiba Goff. He's a PhD and he's co-founder and CEO of the Center for Policing Equity. He said, quote, "No black community has ever taken to the streets demanding that white people would just love us more. Communities march to stop the killing. Racism is about behaviors, not feelings." Now, as you'll see later, I in one sense agree with this, and in another sense I disagree with it. Now, what has really prompted the change in the United States is the murder of George Floyd. Just sort of ignited things, but it hadn't been building, with murders in Ferguson and murders that had happened leading up to that. Just innocent African Americans killed, definitely not deserving of death in the hands of law enforcement. So that is a good point, but now we need to transition, and Senator Cory Booker actually circled back on the comments that exchange between Cornyn and Gupta. When it came his time to speak, he was like, whoa, wait a minute. I'd like to hear from Dr. Philip Atiba Goff to clarify things. And then this is what Dr. Goff said. "The way we've been talking about racism has been a huge distraction. We're trying to solve it. When people are talking about racism in public, they often mean bigotry. They mean the individual feeling or attitude that says, I don't like you, and I'm going to organize my life around that dislike of you." Goff continues, "But when we talk about systemic bias, systemic racism, from a scientific perspective and from a data analytic perspective, that's not what we mean." So in the academy, I love this. He gives a little insight into his professional life. "I'm a professor. I'm a professional nerd. I'm also a professional nerd. The people who work with me, the women who work with me, earn less than the men. That's not evidence I hold bias in my heart because I'm a member of a class that has structural and systemic gender bias. Those are two different things, and it's easy to conflate them because we imagine that prejudice and bigotry are the sole predictor of actual discrimination and therefore systemic outcomes. Nothing could be further from the truth. From a scientific perspective, attitudes like prejudice and bigotry are weak predictors of behavior. The things we need to care about are those behaviors." Remember the quote we started with where he says racism is most centrally about the behaviors or the actions that are taken by individuals. Now let's look at Dr. Jennifer L. Eberhardt. She's a social psychologist at Stanford, and she's done really important research on bias, race, and crime. And as you'll see, she's been influential with regard to decreasing bias in policing and police forces. Now, how racial bias impacts policing. This is from her video talk. I'll put a link to the video in the description if you want to watch the whole thing. But she, in this talk for Now This News, said that she started by wanting to do research on the connection between race and crime and blackness and criminality. And specifically, she noted that just statistically, there's this thing that pops off and begs for explanation. Namely, African Americans in the United States comprise about 13% of the population, but they comprise about 40% of the prison population. So what explains that disparity? And that, in part, is what her research tries to show. But this is how Eberhardt is understanding these terms. So for her, stereotyping is about beliefs. It's a belief you hold about a particular class of people. Prejudice is about the feelings or the attitudes. So you might hold a stereotype and then have a positive or negative, most often negative, feeling or attitude toward that group that you've stereotyped. And then bias is specifically the belief plus the attitude. Now, when bias impacts behavior, then you call that discrimination. Now, for instance, let's get more explicit with this. Let's do an application. Let's imagine the stereotype is the belief that black people are dangerous or prone to criminal behavior. So that's a stereotype, a belief you hold about a group. Now, the prejudice would be the fear, the emotional response, or the attitude, fear of a black person harming your property or person. After all, you hold the belief that blackness is connected to criminality, and the actual prejudice is the fear you have with regard to African Americans, with regard to your safety. And here's a classic example. So you might have a white woman who has the bias that we just talked about, the belief and attitude, against African American men. Now, how does that work itself out in discrimination? Well, she might, for instance, if an African American man is approaching her and she has her purse on her arm and she holds that stereotype and that prejudice, namely that bias, then she might, as he's passing her, just go and clutch her purse a little bit more. After all, for all she believes and knows, that he might be dangerous and might snatch her purse or in some way try to harm her property or person. Now, there are two types of bias that actually result in discrimination. And you might think the last case I just gave is the second type we're going to discuss. The first is conscious or explicit bias. So this is the classic just openly being disparaging of members of a social group. So remember when the white nationalists marched not too long ago in the United States and they were hurling out all sorts of horrible epithets against African Americans and Jewish people and so on. That's like a classic example of conscious bias resulting in discriminatory speech and behavior. The second type of bias is unconscious or implicit bias. And this is when you basically act in ways that you don't recognize. So you act in biased ways and discriminate against others, and you may not recognize it because it's not conscious. And you might disavow it. So let's go back to the example of the white lady clutching her purse when an African American man passes her. If you were to ask her, do you think that African American man was going to snatch your purse? She'd probably say, oh, no. She'd say that, that'd be racist. Why would I think that? And yet her behaviors indicate that she holds an implicit bias and isn't even aware of it. And it results in discriminatory behavior. Here's a quote from a great article that I found, and it's from two authors, Sawyer and Gupta. And they explain implicit attitudes as follows. Implicit attitudes are generally held to be automatic affective evaluations. So there's that favorable or disfavorable part. You have an emotional response. Remember the fear of African Americans with regard to they're dangerous and commit crime in the example we talked about. Resulting from associations. So the associations are the stereotypes. Remember, you associate blackness with criminality. And these result in, that are activated, these associations are activated automatically when you encounter the relevant stimulus. So she came across an African American man while she was holding her purse. That automatically activated that stimulus of him coming near her, automatically activated her association, blackness, criminality, dangerous, and then you have fear, the affective dimension, and then that resulted in the behaviors. Thus, people can harbor implicit biases against social groups without explicitly endorsing them. Remember, if you were to ask her, do you think black people are dangerous? She'd say, oh no, that's racist. I would never believe that. And yet, She holds these implicit biases that work themselves out in behaviors, racist behaviors. For instance, high levels of negative associations regarding blacks may be activated even if those attitudes contrast with individuals' explicit attitudes. So there again, you have the explicit attitude, black people are not dangerous, they aren't all criminals, and yet you have the implicit bias, which says the opposite, namely that they are dangerous and are criminals. As Sawyer and Gupta continued, consequently, implicit and explicit attitudes are understood to operate largely via distinct psychological mechanisms. So you have the immediate response, the more automatic response with regard to thinking, and then you have the deliberate response. These are often called System 1 and System 2. In addition, they are generally thought to be subject to distinct formative experiences and thus to entail distinct routes for change. So what you might do to change an explicit bias may be different from what you do to change an implicit bias. And in fact, we're going to see an example of Dr. Eberhardt, how she worked with the Oakland Police Department to change or hedge against the operation of implicit biases with regard to policing in specific situations. Importantly, implicit racial biases predict negative interracial contact and discriminatory behaviors, including hiring, housing, and education, thus reducing implicit and explicit prejudice is of tremendous theoretical and practical interest. So this brings up the important point that not only do we need policy change, which is super important, we also need to change literally the hearts and minds of the people, or at least put into the system things that hedge against the operation of these biases, which can contribute discriminatory behavior to systems, namely hiring. So in economic sense, what jobs people can get and how much they can make, housing, where they can live, what they can afford, the loans they can get, and education, the schools they can go to, how well funded those schools are or not. Now, racism, I think, is more than just behaviors. So this is where I contrast with Dr. Goff a little bit. I think Goff is right in the context that they were talking about police reform. The focus should be on the behaviors. But he made the leap to say the generalization that racism is just about behaviors. But I think not only do we have to look at behaviors, racist and discriminatory behaviors, we also need to look at the racist attitudes, the implicit, especially racial biases that actually result in those behaviors. So racism isn't just discriminatory behaviors due to bias, it is also the bias itself. So you might call it racist attitudes, that's fine, but racial bias, but it's that stereotype and prejudice working together. So we don't just want to end police brutality against African Americans. Of course, we do want that, but we don't just want that. We also want to address the root issue, which involves debiasing or taking steps to block the bias from working itself out in behaviors. That's the more long-term solution. Of course, we need to work to end police brutality, get rid of police officers that are prone to that, completely defund departments that are riddled with it, just completely overturn the cart and redo the system. I'm all for that. But at the same time, we actually need to, when we're rebuilding the system and when we're addressing the individuals, we need to make sure that there's steps taken that work on the biases that can work themselves out when they're out in the field, when police officers are out in the field and making these tough calls in a heightened scenario where there's potential threat or they're on edge. And we can't, just doing policies won't necessarily impact those moment-by-moment decisions that result in whether, for instance, an African-American man gets shot or not. So now here's the examples she discussed in that video I mentioned. She worked with the Oakland foot pursuit policy. So in Oakland, they had a policy that if you were pursuing a suspect on foot, you could actually follow that suspect into alleys. You could follow that suspect into a backyard and just keep pursuing until you capture him. But what wound up happening is there were a lot of officer-involved shootings because when you have that heightened situation, you're more likely to have your automatic responses be doing the driving. And those implicit biases can result in snap judgments in the moment that result in you thinking there's a threat, overestimating the threat, and associating blackness with danger and criminality. And therefore, you may overreact, overuse your force as a police officer. Now, what Eberhardt suggested to the Oakland Police Department is that when they chase a suspect into an alley or a backyard, they just let him go. And instead of following him into the backyard, they set up a perimeter. Now, what does that do? Well, that removes the officer from the situation that's of heightened fight or flight mode that can result in the implicit biases working. And you set up a perimeter and patrol for them within that perimeter. And as a result of this policy, actually that sort of friction in the system took the implicit biases off the table from operating, and officer-involved shootings went way down. Now, Eberhardt also, interestingly, just gave a TED Talk with regard to her research as well, and it had some updated research. I'll put a link to that video in the description as well. When my research team brought people into our lab and exposed them to faces, we found that exposure to black faces led them to see blurry images of guns with greater clarity and speed. Bias cannot control what we see, but where we look. What we found that prompting people to think of violent crime can lead them to direct their eyes onto a black face and away from a white face. Prompting police officers to think of capturing and shooting and arresting leads their eyes to settle on black faces too. So you have stimulus being introduced, and based on those implicit biases that the officers hold, it can change where they look and what they think they see when they look there. So they might be more prone to quickly make a snap judgment that there's a weapon there, and that requires an elevated use of force to counteract the weapon that the African American suspect has, when actually there may be no weapon there. In fact, of these shootings are often of unarmed African Americans. And she continues, bias can infect every aspect of our criminal justice system. In a large data set of death-eligible defendants, we found that looking more black more than doubled their chances of receiving a death sentence, at least when their victims were white. This effect is significant. Even though we controlled for the severity of the crime and the defendant's attractiveness, and no matter what we controlled for, we found that black people were punished in proportion to the blackness of their physical features. Basically, the more black, the more death-worthy. So, now let's relate this back to systemic racism. Systemic racism is a tendency of a system to unfairly distribute benefits and burdens according to factors that don't warrant such a difference. That is, a black person shouldn't be killed or incarcerated at a higher rate as compared to whites, all else equal. Now, Eberhardt also worked with the Oakland Police Department as follows. As she said, I and a number of my colleagues were able to help the department to reduce the number of stops. So stops can often be a problem. Racial profiling, and African Americans get stopped more, and when they do get stopped, there's a much more heightened sense of where their hands are and so on, and that can result in all sorts of horrible outcomes. And I and a number of my colleagues were able to reduce the number of stops they made to people who were not committing any serious crimes. And we did this by pushing officers to ask themselves a question before each and every stop they made. Is this stop intelligence-led Yes or no? Do they have some sort of good evidence or intelligence on this person such that it warrants a stop? In other words, do I have prior information to tie this particular person to a specific crime? By adding that question to the form officers complete during a stop, they slow down, they pause, they think, why am I considering pulling this person over? Instead of being in the system that is more automatic, you'll actually be in the more deliberate, slow thinking part of cognition. And in that part of cognition, implicit biases don't reign. They don't actually work themselves out in behaviors. And then Eberhardt continues and gives some stats. And an interesting stat, as you can see there, is that African American stops alone fell by 43%. As Eberhardt continues, we know that the brain is wired for bias. And one way to interrupt the bias is to pause and to reflect on the evidence of our assumptions. So we need to ask ourselves, what assumptions do we bring when we step onto an elevator or an airplane? How do we make ourselves aware of our own unconscious bias? Who do these assumptions keep safe? Who do they put at risk? Until we ask these questions and insist that our schools and our courts and our police departments and every institution do the same, we will continue to allow bias to blind us. And if we do, none of us are truly safe. Thus, racism in the criminal justice system works at implicit and explicit levels. Even if members of that system are not explicitly biased against African Americans, that does not prevent implicit bias from impacting policing, sentencing, and interactions with Black people. Now, back to the exchange. Conflation between behaviors as outcomes of a racially biased system and the attitudes of individual actors that contribute to or are part of the system producing those outcomes is what led Senator Cornyn inferring from racist systems to individual actors being racist, and specifically all Americans being racist, not just the police force. That's where he led Gupta. And it led Gupta to the sweeping generalization that all people are implicitly and racially biased. Now, one really interesting thing about this is that you can take the implicit association test, the IAT, that will test for implicit biases. Now, why it's important to not just slide, as Gupta said, between implicit bias and racial bias is that the class of implicit biases is actually quite large. So you have sexist biases, biases against people with regard to how able they are to do work. So bias against disability, bias against people sexually, and race is also one of the categories. So just because someone is implicitly biased and in a particular way, we all are implicitly biased, it doesn't fall out of that everyone is racially biased. So I think Gupta in the moment got led down this rabbit hole to fallacious reasoning by Senator Cornyn's questioning. It was sort of leading questioning, but at the same time, she allowed herself to go there. So I think once we clarify the terms that we're working with and get more clear on implicit bias, how that relates to systemic outcomes and systemic bias within a system, specifically systemic racism within a system, then hopefully we can institute policies and help change people individually with regard to the biases they hold. That is, once they do become conscious and you give them a chance to switch out of the automatic cognition to the more deliberative cognition, then the biases that they hold implicitly won't necessarily work themselves out in discriminatory behavior, and especially in the case that we're looking at, African American men and women, unarmed, being shot and killed by police in the heat of the moment. I hope this video was helpful, and I am so glad that you've been with me on this journey. Keep thinking critically and living courageously, keep living the philosophical life.